My name is Darish Karimi, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how I became exactly what I once swore to destroy. If you're just finding this channel, I want to ask you one simple thing. If this testimony touches something in you, leave a like and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, and it might be exactly what someone else needs to find today. I mean that. These stories don't reach people by themselves. They travel because someone decided they were worth sharing. I was born in Tehran in the winter of 1986, 2 years after the revolution had already reshaped everything my parents knew. My father, Mahmoud, was a man who prayed 5 times a day without fail. I never once saw him miss Fajr, not even when he was sick. Not even when the air outside was so cold your breath turned to smoke the moment you stepped onto the balcony. He would roll out his prayer rug, dark green with a small golden pattern at the top, and he would kneel, and the sound of his voice reciting Surah Al-Fatiha in the early morning darkness was the first sound I associated with safety, with order, with God. My mother, Nasrin, was quieter in her faith but no less devoted. She wore her hijab with a kind of dignity that I only came to appreciate much later in life. She cooked saffron rice every Friday, and the smell of it would fill our entire apartment building, drifting under doors and through windows, a smell I can still close my eyes and find if I try hard enough. She told me once, when I was maybe 7 years old, that every grain of rice was a gift from Allah, and that a man who forgets to be grateful eventually forgets everything else too. I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. We lived in a neighborhood in the east of Tehran where everyone knew everyone else's business, and no one found that unusual. The street where I grew up was narrow, lined with low walls and the kind of dusty plane trees that drop their bark in curling pieces each summer. In the evenings in the warmer months, the men of the neighborhood would sit outside their doors on plastic chairs and drink tea and argue about things that mattered and things that didn't, and I would run between them as a small child, chasing my younger brother Reza through the maze of adult legs, listening without knowing I was listening to everything they said. Politics, faith, history, the revolution, who had sacrificed and who had benefited and who had betrayed. The air in those evenings smelled of dust and tea and cigarette smoke and the particular exhaust of old motorbikes. And it was the smell of my entire childhood. My brother Reza was 3 years younger than me and fundamentally different from me in every way that mattered. Where I was serious, Reza was light. Where I memorized and competed and pressed toward the top of every class, Reza drew elaborate pictures on the margins of his homework and made everyone in the room laugh without appearing to try. My mother loved us both without distinction, I believe, but there was a specific kind of relief in her eyes when she looked at Reza that I don't think was there for me. I was the one she prayed for with a certain urgency. Reza was the one she simply enjoyed. I grew up believing that Iran was the center of something sacred, that we were a chosen people in a chosen land, guardians of the true faith in a world that had gone corrupt and weak. My teachers reinforced this. My uncles reinforced this. The Friday sermons reinforced this. By the time I was 12, I could recite entire passages of the Quran from memory, and I felt a kind of pride in that. Not a humble pride, the kind my mother carried, but a sharp, hard pride, the kind that has edges, the kind that cuts. There was a teacher in my secondary school, a man named Ustad Muradi, who had a particular influence on the way I understood what it meant to be a Muslim man in the Islamic Republic. He was thin and precise, and he wore the same gray jacket every day, and he spoke about faith and national identity as though they were a single continuous thing, as though to be a good Iranian was to be a good Muslim, and to be a good Muslim was to be a servant of the state, and all three were simply different names for the same obligation. I absorbed this completely. It fit with everything my father modeled and everything the sermons confirmed. By the time I was 16, I had a very clear picture of the world. There were those who upheld the true order, and there were those who threatened it, and the duty of a righteous man was to place himself firmly among the former and have no patience for the latter. When I was 17, my cousin Hamid joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He came home for Nowruz in his uniform, and I remember the way my grandfather looked at him, like he was looking at something holy. Hamid was 21, broad-shouldered, serious in a way that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. He didn't talk much about what he did, but the way he carried himself said everything. He was part of something larger than himself. He was a defender of the revolution, of the faith, of Iran itself. And I wanted that more than I had ever wanted anything. I enlisted at 19. My father shook my hand at the door. Firm, formal, the way he always expressed things he felt too deeply to say out loud. My mother held my face in both her hands and whispered something I couldn't quite hear, her lips moving in what I think was a prayer. I turned and walked away and didn't look back, because I was afraid that if I did, something in me would waver. And wavering was not something a soldier of the revolution could afford. The training was harder than I had imagined and exactly as hard as I needed it to be. I was grateful for the difficulty. It confirmed something I already believed, that the weak are separated from the strong, and the strong are separated from the righteous, and the righteous are the ones willing to endure. I endured. I was good at it. My instructors noticed. By the time I completed my basic training, I had been selected for a unit that operated out of a facility I will not name specifically, in a district south of Tehran that most ordinary citizens had no reason to visit and every reason to avoid. I was 22 years old. I believed I was doing the work of God. The facility was not what you might picture when you imagine a prison. It didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked like any other government building. Gray, functional, unremarkable. A large metal gate, a guard booth, a paved courtyard where weeds pushed up through the cracks in the concrete with a persistence that I would have found admirable in any other context. But inside, the halls had a particular smell that I can only describe as the smell of time that has nowhere to go. Damp stone, metal, something underneath that you couldn't quite name, but that your body registered before your mind did. The first time I walked those halls, something in my stomach tightened. I told myself it was reverence, that I was in a place where the enemies of God were held accountable. I believed that completely. I needed to believe it completely. My role in the early months was administrative, processing paperwork, coordinating transfers, managing schedules. I was good at organization, and my commanding officer, a man named Colonel Shirazi, recognized that. He was a lean man, 50 or so, with gray at his temples and a way of looking at you that made you feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. "Karimi," he told me once, standing in the doorway of my small office, "a facility like this runs on precision. Precision is a form of obedience to God. Never forget that." I wrote it down in a small notebook I kept in my breast pocket. I believed him. The other men in my unit were not monsters, and I think that's important to say. They were ordinary men. Men who had families and preferred particular kinds of food and complained about bureaucracy and told jokes that weren't always funny and carried photographs of their children in their wallets. The ability of ordinary men to participate in systems of harm while remaining ordinary in every other dimension of their lives is not a mystery that belongs only to other cultures, other times, other places. I know that now in a way I didn't know it then. Then I would have said we were righteous. I would have said the work was hard and necessary, and that only weak men refused to do hard and necessary things. Over time, my responsibilities expanded. I began accompanying senior officers during interrogations. I want to be honest here. I am not going to minimize what happened in those rooms. I'm also not going to describe it in ways designed to shock you, because that's not what this story's about. What I will tell you is that I witnessed things that I told myself were necessary, justified, that every act of severity was measured against the protection of the Islamic Republic, the protection of the faith, the protection of everything my father prayed for at dawn, and everything my mother whispered over saffron rice on Fridays. I built a wall inside myself, and I maintained it carefully, and for years it held. The prisoners we processed were varied: political dissidents, journalists, activists, people accused of economic crimes. And then there were the ones who were brought in on charges of apostasy and illegal religious activity. Christians mostly, house church leaders, converts, people who had, in the eyes of the state, betrayed both their nation and their God by abandoning Islam for a faith imported from the West, from the enemies of the revolution. These were the ones I had been most thoroughly prepared to despise. And for a long time I did, or at least I told myself I did. The first time I really looked at one of them, really looked, not just processed, was in the spring of my 26th year. His name, according to the paperwork, was Elias Sadeghi. He was 43 years old, a former engineer from Isfahan who had converted to Christianity in his late 30s and had been leading a small home church for several years before someone in his neighborhood reported him. He had been in the facility for about 3 weeks when I first had extended contact with him during an administrative review of his case. He was thin, not the thinness of someone who has always been thin, but the thinness of someone from whom something has been taken. His wrists were marked in a way I won't describe further, but his eyes, I remember his eyes. They were not what I expected. I had expected fear. I was accustomed to fear in that place. Fear was the texture of everything. But Elias Sadeghi looked at me with something that was not fear. It was not defiance either. I didn't have a word for it at the time. I've thought about it many times since, and the closest I can come is this. He looked at me the way someone looks when they know something you don't, and they're not holding it over you, they're simply carrying it. I didn't speak to him that day beyond what the procedure required, but something snagged in me, like a piece of fabric catching on a nail. Small, almost unnoticeable. I pushed it down and went back to my work. Over the following weeks, I saw Elias a handful of times. He never protested loudly. He never cursed the guards or the system or the men who had authority over him. He asked once if he could have a piece of paper and something to write with, and the request was denied, and he received the denial with a nod that looked almost like gratitude, which made no sense to me then and makes a different kind of sense to me now. Once, passing his cell in the early morning, I heard him, very quietly, almost under his breath, singing something, a melody I didn't recognize. I stopped walking for a moment, just a moment. The sound of it was strange in that place, like hearing birdsong inside a machine. The notes were simple and slow and somehow completely out of place, in a way that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but something that sat between them. I kept walking. His health declined. This was not unusual. The conditions of the facility were what they were, and the process was what it was, and I had stopped letting myself think about that too carefully. But with Elias, something was different. I found myself checking the paperwork on his case more often than necessary. I told myself it was administrative diligence. I don't think that was entirely true. One afternoon in late April, I remember because the air coming through the single small window in the corridor had begun to carry something warmer in it, the first hint of real spring. I was summoned to cell block D by one of the junior guards. Elias had deteriorated significantly overnight. He was being attended to, minimally, and a decision was being made about his status. I arrived and stood in the doorway of his cell. He was lying on the narrow cot, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. There were 2 other guards in the room, and a medic who was doing very little because there was very little within the scope of his permitted actions that he could do. The cell smelled of concrete and something metallic that I won't name. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting everything in a slightly greenish pallor. The walls were bare. There was nothing in that cell that belonged to Elias. Nothing personal, nothing he had brought, nothing that said a human being had lived here. Just the man himself on the narrow cot, and his breathing, and the light. I stood there for reasons I couldn't have fully articulated. Official reasons, I told myself. Procedural. And then Elias opened his eyes. He looked directly at me. Not at the wall, not at the ceiling. At me, Daryush Karimi, standing in that doorway in my uniform with my clipboard and my carefully maintained wall inside my chest. He looked at me and his lips moved. His voice was so thin it barely reached me across the small room. But I heard him. Every word. He said, "Don't be afraid, brother. Jesus is standing right here, and he sees you." And then he closed his eyes. He died approximately 40 minutes later. I stood in that corridor for a long time after they told me. The fluorescent light continued to flicker. Somewhere down the hall, someone was shouting something procedural about transfer paperwork. The medic walked past me without making eye contact. The world of that facility continued exactly as it always had, but I was not the same person who had walked into that corridor. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you watching this right now might be in a place where you feel completely alone in whatever you're carrying. I want to ask, where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, because when I was in that corridor, the most terrifying thing wasn't what I had witnessed. It was the feeling that I was the only person in the world having this particular crisis at this particular moment, with no map and no permission to even name what it was. If you're in that place right now, I want you to know you are not alone. Someone else has stood in a corridor like yours. More people than you think are carrying something they have no language for yet. The weeks after Elias died were the strangest of my life. From the outside, I functioned. I showed up. I completed my duties. Colonel Shirazi commended me twice during that period for what he called my consistency. I nodded and thanked him and went back to my desk and sat there looking at paperwork I was not reading, because all I could hear in the back of my mind, running beneath everything like a frequency I couldn't turn off, were those words: Jesus is standing right here, and he sees you. I had been trained to hear that kind of statement as delusion, as the last desperate act of a mind broken by suffering, manufacturing comfort where none existed. I tried to apply that interpretation. It didn't hold. What wouldn't let me dismiss it wasn't the theology. It was the face. The way Elias Sadeghi had looked at me in that moment was not the face of a broken man grasping at something to soften his death. It was the face of someone reporting a fact, calmly, without agenda, without even, as far as I could tell, any particular expectation that I would believe him. He wasn't trying to convert me. He was just telling me something he knew. That distinction undid something in me that I am still not entirely able to explain. I began, very carefully and very privately, to ask questions I had never permitted myself to ask. About the faith I had been born into, about the system I served, about the gap, which I had always been aware of but had refused to examine, between what I was told I was doing and what I actually saw happening every day in that facility. I asked these questions only inside my own head, late at night, lying on my cot in the quarters I shared with 3 other officers, listening to one of them snore and watching the faint light from the corridor slide under the door. I thought about my father and his prayer rug, the dark green one with the golden pattern. I thought about his voice in the early morning darkness, the sound of Al-Fatiha, the safety I had felt in that sound as a small child. I asked myself honestly, was the God I had grown up believing in the same God who ran that facility? The same God who had authorized what happened to Elias Sadeghi? I had always answered that question with yes and felt righteous in the yes. Now the yes felt like a door I had been leaning against without knowing what was on the other side. I started to wonder what was on the other side. There was a night, I think it was about 3 weeks after Elias died, when I lay awake longer than usual and found myself doing something I had done as a child but not as an adult. I was talking to God, not reciting, not performing the formal structure of prayer, just talking in the private silence of my own mind, the way you talk to someone when you're not sure they're listening but you need to speak anyway. I said something like, "If you are truly just, then what I have witnessed cannot be your will. And if it is your will, then I do not understand you. And if I do not understand you, then I have been serving something I cannot name." I didn't receive an answer that night, but asking the question changed something. It opened a door I hadn't known was there. About 6 weeks after Elias died, I did something I had never done before, and that carried significant personal risk. I sought out a small bookshop in a neighborhood I had no professional reason to visit, run by an elderly man named Aga Rostami, who was known very quietly among certain people as someone who had access to materials not officially sanctioned. I didn't go in looking for a Bible specifically. I told myself I was just looking. I was a man who had questions, and questions needed material. The shop smelled of old paper and dust and something faintly sweet, tea I think, from a glass the old man was holding when I walked in. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, took me in slowly, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What is it you're looking for, young man?" And I said, honestly, "I'm not sure yet." He nodded as if that was the correct answer and pointed me toward the back of the shop. I spent almost an hour in there, moving slowly along the shelves, touching spines without pulling them out. The shop was narrow and the shelves were packed tightly, and the light came from a single lamp in the corner that made everything feel amber and slightly dreamlike. I was aware of Aga Rostami watching me from the front of the shop without appearing to watch me, which is a skill old men in certain kinds of shops seem to develop naturally. When I finally made my way back to the front with 3 books in my hand, he looked at them and then at me and said nothing. He wrapped them in brown paper and told me a price, and I paid it, and he handed them over, and that was all. I left with 3 books, one of which was a Persian language New Testament, slim, with a worn cover, tucked between 2 other volumes in a paper bag. I carried it back to my quarters under my jacket, heart beating faster than I had any sensible reason for, and hid it inside the lining of a bag I kept under my cot. For 2 weeks, I didn't open it. I would lie in bed and know it was there and not open it. I'm not sure what I was afraid of exactly. I think I was afraid that if I opened it and it said nothing, if it was just words on a page that meant nothing to me, then I would have no explanation for what Elias had done to me, and I would have to live the rest of my life with an unanswerable question lodged in my chest like a piece of shrapnel. Better not to know. Better to leave the bag under the cot. But on the 14th night, at some hour past midnight when the corridor was quiet and my roommates were asleep, I reached under the cot and unzipped the bag. The cover of the New Testament was slightly rough under my fingers. The pages smelled of something I can't quite identify. Slightly different from the other books in the shop. Slightly sharper. Newer. I opened it without a plan. I didn't know where to go. I started almost randomly in the middle. My eyes landed on a passage in the Gospel of John. Chapter 8. A woman caught in sin, surrounded by men with stones, and Jesus kneeling in the dirt, writing something with his finger. Everyone waiting for him to authorize what they had already decided to do. And instead he said, "Let the one who is without sin throw the first stone." And one by one, they walked away. I read it 3 times. Then I kept reading. I read for 2 hours until the corridor light shifted in a way that told me morning was coming, and I hid the book again and lay on my back in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Something was happening inside me that I didn't have language for. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like pressure. Like something pressing against the inside of a door I had kept shut for 32 years. Not violent pressure, patient pressure. The kind that says, "I'm not going anywhere. Take your time." But I'm here. Over the following weeks, I read the entire New Testament. I read it in pieces and stolen moments, in the bathroom with the book pressed flat against my thigh, in the early morning minutes before my roommates woke, in the back of a vehicle during a transfer I wasn't driving. I read the Sermon on the Mount and felt my uniform grow heavy on my shoulders. I read about Jesus touching a leper, deliberately when he could have healed him from a distance. And I had to sit with that for several days. The deliberateness of the touch, the choice to make contact with someone that every structure of his society said to avoid. I read the crucifixion and had to stop and press my palms against my face in the dark. I read the resurrection and sat very still for a long time. Not moving, not thinking, just sitting with the impossible weight of it. There was something about this Jesus that I had not been prepared for. I had been taught that Christianity was a religion of weakness, of sentimentality, of people who couldn't handle the demands of a truly disciplined faith. But the Jesus I was reading about was not weak. He was something more unsettling than strong. He walked into situations that powerful men had arranged to trap him, and he found the one thing that was actually true inside them, and he said it plainly, without flinching. And the men with the traps walked away confused. He touched what no one else would touch. He spoke to people that his culture had decided didn't count. He didn't ask permission from the structures of authority around him when those structures required him to do something he knew was wrong. And then at the end, he let himself be killed by those structures. Not because he had to, the text made clear he didn't have to, but because he chose to, because there was something on the other side of that death that required him to go through it first. I didn't understand all of it. I still don't understand all of it, but I understood enough. And then, on an evening in early July, alone in a small storage room where I had gone under the pretext of retrieving some equipment, I did something I had never done and was not sure I knew how to do. I spoke to Jesus, not as an experiment, not as a test. I spoke to him because everything I had read and everything I had felt, and the face of Elias Sadeghi, and the flicker of that fluorescent light, and the sound of that thin voice saying, He sees you. All of it had brought me to a place where not speaking to him was no longer an option I could honestly choose. I sat on the floor of that storage room with my back against a metal shelf, and I said out loud in barely a whisper, "If you are real, if you are actually who you say you are, then you see me right now, and you know everything I've done, and I don't know what to do with any of it." I don't know exactly what I expected. A light, a voice, something dramatic. What happened was both less and more than that. What happened was a silence that was not empty. A silence with presence in it, the way a room feels different when someone you love walks into it even before you turn to look. I sat in that storage room for a long time. When I got up, I was not the same person who had sat down. That was the moment. I can't make it more dramatic than it was, and I can't make it less significant than it was. Darish Karimi met Jesus Christ on the floor of a storage room in a facility whose name I still won't say, somewhere south of Tehran, surrounded by metal shelves and the faint smell of cleaning solution. And Jesus was there. I know what I'm saying. I know how it sounds. I'm telling you anyway because it is the truest thing I know. The weeks that followed were the most complicated of my life. I had no community. I had no pastor, no church, no person I could sit across from and say what I needed to say. I had only the New Testament and the memory of a dead man's last words in a silence that had a presence in it. I continued doing my job. I continued wearing my uniform. I continued answering to Colonel Shirazi. And I walked around every day with the sensation that I was carrying something inside me that was fundamentally incompatible with everything around me, like holding a lit flame in a room full of things that burn. I began making small decisions, things that could be dismissed as administrative, as procedural, as human error, if examined from the outside. Documentation that somehow didn't make it into the right file at the right time. Transfer requests that were processed in ways that created delays. Nothing that could be definitively traced. Nothing dramatic. Just the beginning of a man trying to do less harm with the position he was still occupying, while he figured out what came next. I was not brave. I want to be clear about that here. What I was doing was small and insufficient, and I knew it was small and insufficient. And I did it anyway because it was the only thing I knew how to do while I lived inside a situation I had not yet found a way out of. I also began to pray differently, not the formal prayers I had performed since childhood. Those felt increasingly hollow, like a phone ringing in an empty room. I prayed the way I had spoken to Jesus in the storage room, directly, without performance. In the middle of the night when sleep wouldn't come, or during the slow hours of the afternoon when the facility went quiet and the only sounds were distant and institutional. I would close my eyes and speak as plainly as I knew how. Sometimes I felt that presence that wasn't emptiness. Sometimes I felt nothing. But I kept going back, because there was nowhere else to go. What came next arrived faster than I had planned. In the fall of that year, a fellow officer named Farsan, a man I had worked alongside for 3 years, someone I had eaten dinner with, argued about football with, someone whose daughter's name I knew. Farzan noticed something. I'm not entirely certain what it was. A pattern in the paperwork. A look on my face at a moment I hadn't been careful enough. Something. He didn't confront me directly. He went to Shirazi. I found out because Shirazi called me into his office on a Tuesday morning and asked me very calmly, with his hands folded on his desk, whether there was anything I wanted to tell him about my recent conduct. I looked at him across that desk. The office smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular synthetic scent of cheap air freshener that all institutional buildings seem to use. There was a photograph of Khomeini on the wall behind him, and beside it a framed verse from the Quran in ornate calligraphy. The verse was one I had memorized as a child. I knew every word of it. Looking at it on that wall, in that office, I felt something I can only describe as a clean sadness. Not anger, not resentment, just a clear recognition that something I had once believed was true had turned out to be something else, and that this was a loss worth grieving even as I was walking away from it. I looked at all of it, and then I looked back at Shirazi and I said, "No, sir, nothing I can think of." He held my gaze for a moment that felt significantly longer than it was. Then he nodded, slowly, and said, "Good. Because a man whose loyalties become unclear is a man who becomes a problem. And problems in this facility have a way of becoming residents. Do you understand me, Karimi? Yes, sir, I said, perfectly. I walked out of that office and down the corridor, and I kept my pace measured and my face neutral until I turned a corner and was alone. And then I stopped and pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes and breathed. I had maybe a small number of days, a week, perhaps 2 if I was lucky. The kind of institution Shirazi ran did not let suspicion rest for long before it acted on it. I contacted my cousin Hamid that night. This was a risk in itself. Hamid was still in the IRGC, in a different unit, in a different city, and calling him from a facility phone about anything personal was the kind of thing that could be reviewed. But I called from a public phone 2 blocks away during my lunch break, and I kept it brief. I told him I needed help. I didn't tell him why. He asked only 2 questions. Are you in danger? And when? I said yes to the first and soon to the second. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear the street noise in the background of wherever Hamid was standing. Then Hamid said, "Okay, give me 3 days." Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I went to work. I ate in the canteen. I exchanged the normal minimal words with colleagues. I slept perhaps 4 hours each night, lying rigid in my cot, listening for anything that sounded like it was coming toward me with intention. On the second night, I opened the New Testament one final time, sitting in the bathroom with the tap running slightly so that the sound covered the rustle of pages. I opened it to the 14th chapter of John. I had read it before, but something made me go back. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I read it several times. I held it. Then I closed the book and sat on the cold tile floor with my back against the wall, and I breathed and I said, very quietly, I believe you. That was all. Just that. What Hamid arranged, I will not detail fully, not because I want to be dramatic, but because there are people involved in what he did whose safety still matters and whose identities should not be made any more traceable than they already are. What I will tell you is that on a Thursday evening, I walked out of my quarters with a single bag, clothes, the Persian New Testament, and a photograph of my parents taken sometime in the 1990s. My mother smiling in a way I don't often see in my memory of her. And I did not go back. There were several days that involved vehicles and border regions and people I had never met who treated me with a matter-of-fact kindness that undid me in small ways each time. A woman in a rural house who gave me tea without asking any questions, who set it down in front of me on a low table, and then went back to whatever she had been doing before I arrived, as though sheltering strangers were simply part of an ordinary day. A man who drove for 6 hours through the night and spoke only to offer me water from a bottle he kept on the seat beside him. The darkness outside the windows was complete, and the road noise and the hum of the engine and the occasional distant light were all there was. And I sat in the passenger seat and looked at the dark and understood for the first time in my adult life that I had no idea what came next, and that this was not the terrifying thing I had always assumed it would be. A younger man, maybe 20, who waited with me in a cold room for several hours and eventually said, unprompted, "It's okay to be scared. Everyone is scared the first time." I said, "The first time of what?" He said, "Of choosing to actually live." I crossed into Turkey on a Friday. The morning was gray, and the air smelled of damp earth and something I eventually identified as pine resin from the trees on the hillside. I stood on the other side of a line that was invisible on the ground, but that had just entirely restructured my life. And I breathed in that cold pine air, and I said something to Jesus. I didn't plan it, it just came out. I said, "Okay, I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here." I want to be honest about the time that followed because I think it's important not to make conversion sound like the end of difficulty. It wasn't. Turkey was disorienting and lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spoke no Turkish. My Farsi was useful with some communities, but not all. I had limited resources and a legal status that was uncertain, and a past I couldn't discuss openly, and a faith that I was still figuring out how to even describe to myself, let alone to others. I stayed in a small apartment in Istanbul with 2 other Iranian men I had never met, both of whom had their own reasons for being where they were, and neither of whom I trusted enough to be fully honest with, at least not right away. The apartment was on the fourth floor of a building near the water, and in the mornings I would sit by the window and watch the light move across the Bosphorus and try to pray, and sometimes be able to, and sometimes not. The smell of salt water and diesel from the ferries was constant, and below the window a bread seller pushed his cart through the street every morning at the same time, and the smell of the bread reached me even 4 floors up. These sensory details, the light on the water, the bread, the particular chill in the air off the strait in the early morning, became a kind of anchor for me, something real and immediate to press myself against when the weight of everything I had left and everything I was uncertain about threatened to become too large. I found a church almost by accident, a Persian-speaking congregation that met in a rented room above a textile shop on a street whose name I could not pronounce. I walked past it on a Sunday morning and heard singing. That particular sound, something in the melody, reminded me of what I had heard from Elias in his cell. I stopped on the sidewalk. A woman coming out of the building looked at me standing there and said, "In Farsi, are you looking for the service?" I said, "I don't know what I'm looking for." She said, "That's usually how people end up here. Come in." Her name was Mariam. She was maybe 50, with silver in her dark hair and the manner of someone who has navigated significant difficulty and come out on the other side of it without bitterness, which is a specific kind of strength I have a great deal of respect for. She brought me inside and sat beside me and didn't ask me anything. The room was small and warm and slightly too bright from the overhead lights, and it smelled of tea from a samovar in the corner and someone's perfume and old carpet. About 30 people were gathered. A young man with a guitar was leading the singing. The song was in Farsi, and I didn't know the words, but I knew the shape of it. The way it rose and fell, the particular quality of longing in it, something reaching towards something larger than itself. I sat in that plastic chair and listened to Farsi worship songs I didn't know, in a rented room above a textile shop in Istanbul, and something that had been clenched in my chest for months began, slowly, carefully, to release. I didn't cry right then. I waited until I was alone that evening, back in the small apartment, sitting on the edge of my cot in the dark. Then I cried for a long time. The kind of crying that doesn't have a clean explanation. Not sadness exactly, not relief exactly. The kind that happens when a wound that has been held tightly together finally gets to open and breathe. I began attending that congregation regularly. The pastor, a man named Pastor Davud, was from Shiraz originally and had been a Christian for about 15 years, and he had a patience with new believers, especially new believers with complicated histories, that I can only describe as a gift he must have worked very hard for. He didn't press me for my story. He just kept being present. He would sit with me after services with tea and ask careful, open questions and listen without evaluating the answers. Once, several weeks in, when I finally told him more specifically what I had been and what I had been part of, I expected something. Withdrawal, perhaps. Discomfort. A recalibration of how he looked at me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Darius, the man who held the coats while Stephen was stoned became the man who wrote half the New Testament. God is not surprised by your past. He was already working in it." I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. There were hard weeks during that period, weeks when the weight of what I had been part of sat on me in a way I couldn't lift. I would wake in the night with specific faces in my mind. People I had seen in that facility, people whose names I had processed on forms, people I had escorted through corridors. I didn't know what had happened to all of them. I still don't. That is something I have had to learn to carry without being crushed by it. Pastor Davud helped me understand something about repentance that I hadn't grasped from my reading alone. That it is not a single act, but a direction. A continuous turning towards something, carried out imperfectly and repeatedly over a long period of time. That the goal is not to arrive somewhere clean, but to keep turning, to keep choosing to face a different direction, even on the mornings when turning feels impossible. The process of asylum was long and bureaucratic and involved forms and interviews and waiting rooms and a specific kind of fluorescent-lit institutional patience that was, I noted with some dark humor, not entirely unlike the environments I was accustomed to. though for very different reasons. It took the better part of 2 years. During that time, I learned Turkish haltingly, attended the Persian congregation faithfully, began meeting with Pastor Davud regularly for what he called discipleship, and what I experienced as the slow, careful reconstruction of a self that had been built on foundations I no longer trusted. Miriam became something like family during those 2 years. She had arrived in Istanbul from Tehran about 5 years before me, and her story had its own weight that she shared with me in pieces over many cups of tea in many different settings. She cooked Persian food sometimes and would bring portions to the apartment in containers, and the smell of it, herbs and saffron and something fried in the right oil, was so specifically the smell of home that the first time she did it, I had to excuse myself and stand in the bathroom for a few minutes with my hand against the cold tile wall. She never commented on that. She just kept bringing food. I thought about my parents every day. My father with his prayer rug, my mother and her saffron rice. I had sent one message through a careful channel shortly after I crossed the border, letting them know I was alive. I received nothing back. I don't know what they were told about my disappearance or what they believe happened to me. I don't know if they think of me with anger or with grief or with something more complicated than either. I pray for them every day, specifically by name, the way my father used to pray for us in the early morning darkness. I haven't been able to speak to them. That is a grief I carry alongside everything else, and I don't pretend it's resolved, because it isn't. Some things take time that can't be rushed. Forgiveness is like that. Reconciliation is like that. I put them in God's hands because that is the only place large enough to hold what I can't. What I can tell you is that the faith I came to through Elias Sadegi's death, through a worn New Testament hidden under a cot, through a storage room floor, and a silence with presence in it, that faith has not been easy, but it has been real. More real than anything else I have ever held on to. Jesus did not promise me safety. He did not promise me that my family would be restored, or that my past would be erased, or that the weight of what I participated in would simply lift from my shoulders. What he promised was that he would be present in it, that he would walk through it with me, that the darkness I had contributed to was not the end of the story, not mine, not the world's. I was baptized on a cold Sunday in February in a bathtub in the back room of a church in Istanbul with Mariam and Pastor Davud and about 15 members of the congregation crowded into that small space and someone crying in the corner. I don't know who. I couldn't see properly through my own wet eyes. The water was not quite warm enough. The overhead light in that bathroom buzzed slightly. Someone was holding a candle near the door, and the flame of it moved in the air currents from all the bodies in that small room. And when I came up out of that water, gasping a little from the cold, hands reaching to steady me, I was Dariush Karimi. And I had been Dariush Karimi my entire life, but I was also, for the first time, exactly who I was supposed to be. I stood dripping on the tile floor of that small bathroom with these people who had known me for only a short time, but who had chosen, without drama, to become my family. And I thought about Elias Sadegi. I thought about him lying on that narrow cot in that cell with the flickering light. I thought about a man who had given up security and safety and the approval of everyone around him to follow something he believed was true. I thought about the fact that what he said with his last breath was not a declaration of victory or a condemnation of his captors. It was a message for me, a specific, direct, improbable message for one person standing in a doorway with a clipboard. That is not a small thing. I don't think I will ever be done thinking about it. I think about Elias often. I think about what it cost him to convert in a country like ours. I think about the years he led that small house church, gathering people in someone's living room, singing quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear, passing around bread and a cup of something that meant more than its ingredients. I think about the courage that required, the specific, sustained, unspectacular courage of doing something day after day that could end badly, not because you don't know it could end badly, but because you believe it's worth doing anyway. I think about his last words, and I think about the fact that he chose to spend them on me. A man in a uniform standing in a doorway, holding a clipboard. He could have said anything. He could have said nothing. He said, Jesus is standing right here, and he sees you. I believe Elias is with the Jesus he told me about. I believe that when I finally stand in that same place, whenever that is and however that happens, Elias Sedeghi is going to be one of the first faces I see. And I believe that what passed between us in that cell, the thing I cannot fully explain and have never stopped carrying, was not random, was not coincidence, was not the hallucination of a dying man. It was the beginning of a story that Jesus had already written, that I was just now learning to read. My name is Dariush Karimi. I was a soldier of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I held authority over people I had been taught to consider enemies of God, and one of those people in his dying breath introduced me to the only authority that has ever made me feel genuinely free. I am not who I was. I am not finished becoming who I will be, but I know whose I am. And that turns out to be enough to build a life on. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want to say something directly to you. This channel exists because testimonies like mine, like the ones that will come after mine, need to reach the people who need them. People who are in the middle of a corridor with no map. People who are carrying questions they haven't been given permission to ask. People who heard something, or saw something, or felt something, and don't know what to do with it yet. If that's you, subscribe. Stay close. Share this with someone who needs it, because Elias Sedeghi spent his last breath making sure I heard something true. And the least Dariush Karimi can do is make sure that truth travels as far as it can reach. Jesus is still standing right here, and he still sees you.